Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. You're going to be hearing a lot about the climate this week. It's Climate Week, and we wanted to take some time to focus on climate risk. If you're a company with operations in an area at an increased risk for floods, how do you plan? Steve Bochanski, PwC's U.S. climate risk modeling leader, is here to share his insights on how companies are and can strategically deal with climate change disruption. Steve, welcome.
Thanks, Sindhu.
So let's start off by talking about climate risk modeling. What is it, and what issues are companies facing?
Yeah, so there's really two main components, two sides to climate risk. There's the physical risk, which is intuitive. That's the things that we all are experiencing, frankly, and hear about on the news. That's increased frequency and severity of hurricanes and wildfires and tornadoes, and then longer term impacts like drought and sea level rise and extreme heat. And then there's the flip side, which is transition risk, which is essentially the business risk that emerges as we hopefully transition to a lower carbon economy.
Okay. Yeah. And what are the specific concerns of executives, and how does climate risk modeling address those concerns?
The concerns are what you would expect. I mean, I think we're coming to the realization now that climate risk really is business risk. And so there's an existential threat really to companies as they think about how they're going to continue to operate in the long term, facing more extreme weather and facing some uncertain environments in terms of the regulatory landscape, reporting landscape, other components of transition risk. So really where companies are right now is just starting to get a handle of it, just starting to understand their exposure, starting to understand where they're facing risks and what they can do about it.
Okay, and what are the long and short-term benefits of measuring in financial terms?
You know, they say you can't manage what you don't measure, and so I think fundamentally that's the first step, is to understand your exposure, understand where you've got risk exposure, whether it's in your operations, in your supply chain, in your labor force, or regulatory exposure, litigation exposure. And so longer term, it's about better preparing your business, taking advantage of strategic advantages to improve your long-term outlook. And in the short term, it's sort of table stakes. I mean, just needing to understand what your exposure is. Investors are demanding it, regulators are demanding it, and it's really just prudent business.
So Steve, companies have the information now. So what's the next step? How do they measure this, and how do they implement?
I think first thing I would say is companies don't have all the information right now. And one of the challenges that they're facing is there's a skill gap. I mean, most companies don't employ climate scientists, right? And even if they have access to data, they often don't know how to use it or how to apply it to their business. So they're getting there. They're starting to get there. And some companies are farther along, but the first step is sort of getting that basic capability or getting help to do that. From there, it's about sort of understanding long-term exposure. The time periods that we think about with climate are longer than any typical planning horizon. So there's a mindset shift that's necessary to sort of get beyond how do I survive for the next 1 or 3 or 5 years into the time period that climate risk is relevant. And then once you've kind of taken that leap, it's seeing what useful information you get from the analysis and then making decisions around mitigation, hardening your buildings, or changing your, potentially changing locations or altering different components of your supply chain. Okay,
now let's get into some granular steps. So suppose I'm a company and I've not thought about this, let's just say, and I'm in some high risk area. What are the first steps that I need to take to kind of be on my way to protecting myself?
So first thing is to do a qualitative risk assessment. And I think what you would find is that what you mentioned, if I'm a company in a high risk area, every company is exposed to climate change, climate risk in one way or another. There are companies clearly that are exposed to physical risk because they're in a high risk location for hurricanes or wildfires or floods or things like that. But every company faces exposure to transition risk. And if you look at just some of the things that have happened very recently, I mean, we're waiting for the SEC rule to be finalized and released. But just last week, California passed a couple of bills that essentially are bypassing the SEC, and California is not waiting. So companies that do business in California, this is a very real regulatory risk that they face right now to get ready for that reporting requirement. European companies, the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, is already in force. And so Many companies are actively preparing for that. So you've sort of got, you're exposed in one way or another. So the first step is understanding how you're exposed, and a qualitative risk assessment can really help you do that.
Okay.
I will say that the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, all of the major regulatory proposals or rules are based on the TCFD in some way. And the reason for that, one reason for that, is it's quite a good disclosure. It sort of outlines ways to think about your climate risk exposure. There's a really good taxonomy of different climate-related risks and opportunities that you can use to evaluate where you stand.
Okay. Steve, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, Sindhu. Thank you.
And thank you, as always, for tuning in. Stay with Policy on Demand for the latest developments from Washington and around the world. Take care.